She was on the porch before the light came up. The sky over Cora County was still that deep, bruised purple that precedes dawn, the kind of dark that makes the ridgeline look like a cut in the earth, rather than a rise above it. December frost had silvered the fence posts and the top rail of the corral, and Biscuit stood in the yard below, exhaling slow clouds into the cold, the way he always did when the temperature dropped into the single digits, and he wanted you to know he'd noticed. Clayton West stood at the top of the porch steps with her coat buttoned to the chin and her hands at her sides, and she was not pacing, not watching the road, not doing anything that might be mistaken for anxiety. She was simply standing there, waiting, the way a woman waits who has already done the work and is merely letting the calendar catch up. When Everett Crane's rig appeared at the far end of the lane, the sky behind the ridge had just begun to go gray at the edges. She watched him drive it up toward the house, the horse's breath rising in twin plumes. She watched him set the brake and climb down, watched him pull his coat straight and reach back for his leather satchel, watched him look up and see her there. He stopped walking for just a moment. Then he came on toward the steps, and Clayton reached into her coat pocket and took out a folded envelope, and she held it out to him before he had said a single word. That was December of 1883. It was not the beginning of the story. It was the end of one season of it, and the beginning of a much longer one. To understand what she was handing him, and what it cost to hold it, you have to go back to the spring, and to Harlan West's last winter, and to the ledger he left behind. Harlan West died in March of 1883, which is the worst month to die if you are a rancher and you are leaving someone else to manage what you built. The ground was still frozen, the calving had not finished, and the hay supply was down to the last few bales. He had a lung fever that had started as a cough in January, and by February had settled into something more permanent, and by the 1st of March, he was gone. He was 41 years old. He left behind a farm of 240 acres in Cora County, Wyoming Territory, 38 head of cattle, a bay work mule named Biscuit, a daughter named Dora who had just turned 9, and a note against the property for $480 held by the First Territorial Bank of Rawlins. He also left behind Clayton, who was 34 years old, and had spent 14 years learning how a ranch works by watching and by doing, and who had never, in all those years, been shown the ledger. That was Harlan's way. He was not a cruel man or a small one. He had simply grown up in a world where the numbers were the husband's business, and he had never questioned that arrangement. And neither had she, not out loud. She had kept the house and helped with the calving, and read the weather off the land with a precision that still surprised the neighbors. But the books had stayed in Harlan's desk drawer. And when he died, that drawer was the last thing she opened. She opened it on a Tuesday evening in late March after Dora had gone to sleep. She took the ledger to the kitchen table and set the lamp close and read it the way she read the land, steadily and without flinching, understanding that what she found there was just information, that information was always better than not having it, no matter what it was. What she found was this. The note was $480, as she'd known from the bank's initial correspondence. What she had not known was that Harlan had taken a second lien against the spring cattle receipts to cover the cost of feed the previous winter, and that lien was still partially unsatisfied, running to $62 owed to a feed supplier in town. She had not known that the winter hay supply, which looked thin to her eye, was thinner than she'd understood, because Harlan had been selling off bales through January to cover the lien payment, which was why the calves were born into a barn with less insulation than they needed. She had not known that 3 of the cattle she'd assumed were sound were on Harlan's own notes as doubtful, thin animals that had survived 2 hard winters by the skin of their teeth and were unlikely to carry a third. She sat at the table for a long time after she finished reading. Dora was asleep in the back room, and the lamp was burning low, and Biscuit was in the corral outside, and the spring wind was moving through the cottonwoods at the creek. She did not feel despair exactly. She felt the particular weight of a problem that has been invisible and has now become visible. And she understood that the weight was the same either way, that it had been there all along, but that now she could at least put her hands on it. She closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer. In the morning, she would make a list. The formal notice from the bank arrived in August. Everett Crane delivered it himself, which she later understood was a gesture that was meant to be courteous, or at least that was how he would have explained it. He drove out from Rawlins on a Thursday morning in late summer heat and tied his horse at the corral and introduced himself with the careful politeness of a man who expects to be received with emotion and has prepared his manner accordingly. He was perhaps 45, with a broad-brimmed hat and a suit that was too heavy for August. He told her that the note had been in arrears since Harlan's death, that the bank had extended the estate considerable patience through the spring and into summer, and that the board had now determined that a formal cure period was necessary. He gave her 90 days. She asked him to repeat the figure he had on record for the balance. He opened his satchel and found his papers and told her $480, principal and accumulated interest, through the date of the notice. She asked about the $62 owed to the feed supplier, and he told her that was a separate matter and not the bank's concern, though she might consider settling it, as unpaid trade debts had a way of complicating title. She thanked him for coming out personally. He told her, not unkindly, that if she found herself uncertain how to proceed, the bank would consider a fair offer on the property. He named a figure. She heard the figure. She did not repeat it back to him. He drove away, and she stood in the yard, watching the dust settle. And then she went back to the list she had been keeping since March and picked up her pencil and wrote 90 days at the top. If you asked anyone in Cora County that summer what they made of her chances, they would have been honest with you, which is to say they would have told you plainly that they didn't see how she'd manage it. The county had seen this before. A widow with a working ranch and a note against it, and nobody to run the cattle work. The land was good, the water was sound, and the cattle were decent stock. But hay season was 6 weeks out, and the fence along the north pasture had 3 sections down, and there was nobody at the west place but a woman and a 9-year-old girl and a mule. The sentiment in town was not cruel. It was just the arithmetic as people read it. Amos Tilley read it differently, though he kept that opinion to himself. Amos ran the adjacent spread to the west, 80 acres of his own, plus a grazing lease on the ridge above. He was 61 that summer, a widower of 8 years, a small, quiet man who had come out to Wyoming from Missouri in 1866 and had been ranching Cora County ground ever since. He and Harlan had been neighbors for 11 years and had been, for most of that time, something less than friends. Not enemies and not strangers, but men who shared a fence line and a water source and a complicated history that went back to a moment 7 years earlier when Amos had offered Harlan the use of his haying equipment during a season when Harlan's own mower had broken a blade, and Harlan had turned him down. Harlan had not wanted the obligation. Amos had understood that and had let it go. But the offer had sat between them uncollected ever since. In early September, Clayton rode over to his place on a Monday morning and knocked at his door. She had not told Dora she was going. Dora was at school in town, a 4-mile ride each way that she made on the small gray pony Harlan had bought her 2 Christmases ago, and she would not be home until late afternoon. Clayton had ridden Biscuit, who moved at a steady, flat-footed walk and minded the load without complaint, the way he always did. Amos came to the door and looked at her and then looked at the mule. She told him about the note and the 90 days. She told him about the feed lien and the doubtful cattle and the north fence. She told him she needed the use of his haying equipment for 3 weeks to cut and stack the east and lower south pastures, and that in exchange she would split the cut with him, 40% to his barn, 60 to hers, and that she would send Dora over twice a week through October and November to help with whatever his own situation required. Amos was quiet for a while after she finished. He looked out past the corral to the ridge, where the grass was already yellowing in the early September heat. Then he said that Harlan had turned down a fair offer once, and that he had made his peace with that, but that it hadn't been easy. She said she knew it. She said Harlan had his ways and she had hers. He looked at her for a moment more. Then he said he supposed they could try it and see. They started cutting the following Monday. Amos brought his mower and rake and the 2 good horses that pulled them, and they worked through the east pasture in 4 days, Clayton driving the rake and Amos managing the mower swathe, and they moved to the lower south on day 5 and finished it by the end of the week. The hay came out well, a dry summer having cured the grass to a better density than the previous year. And when they tallied the windrows, Amos said without any visible pleasure that it was a cleaner cut than he'd expected. Clayton stacked her 60% in the barn and covered it with canvas she had mended over the summer and told him the 40% was his to haul when he was ready. Dora came to Amos's twice that first week, as agreed, and raked out his small kitchen garden and carried firewood from the woodpile to the house. She was a quiet, watchful child who had taken to the arrangement without complaint, though Clayton had noticed her watching the road in the evenings, which was how Dora showed worry, not by speaking it, but by looking at the direction things might come from. One night in September after supper, Dora asked if they were going to lose the farm. Clayton was washing the plates, and she did not stop washing them. She said that was not going to happen. Dora said the boy at school had told her the bank would take it. Clayton set the plate she was holding on the drying board and turned around. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, and then she said that boys at school had told people wrong things for a very long time, and that this would not be an exception. Dora did not look entirely convinced, but she picked up the drying cloth and came to stand beside her mother and did not ask again. What you need to know as the days of that September and then October moved through the calendar is how the money was being assembled. It is worth being precise about this, because precision is what held the thing together. The cattle that were doubtful, the 3 thin animals Harlan had flagged in the ledger, Clayton sold in late September to a buyer from Casper who was not asking for prime stock and knew it. She got $9 a head for them, $27 total. She sold 4 of the sounder animals at the fall market in town, selecting the ones that had put on good weight over the summer. Those went for $19 a head, which was a fair price for Wyoming beef in the fall of 1883. That was $76. She sold a portion of the hay surplus, the amount above what she calculated the remaining herd would need through April, to 2 other county ranches that had come up short that summer. That brought in $51, though she had to borrow Amos's wagon for 3 deliveries, and she paid him for the use of it with 2 of her stacking days' labor, which felt like the right accounting. Together, the cattle sales and hay sales gave her $154 by the end of October. The feed lien of $62 she paid off in full on the 1st of October, because she did not want a complication on the title, as Crane had mentioned, and also because owing a man money for something your husband bought and did not pay for is exactly the kind of debt that should not outlast the winter. That left her $92 cash and the $480 still to settle. She was, in other words, $388 short at the end of October. with fewer than 60 days remaining, and the haying was done and the surplus sold and the cattle reduced to 35 head, that she was not willing to sell further. Amos, when she told him where she stood, sat on the top rail of his corral and looked at the sky for a while. Then he said he had $250 in a savings account at a bank in Laramie that he had been keeping against the need to replace his equipment, and that he would lend her what she was short if she would agree to pay it back at 5% simple interest over 2 years. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without drama or ceremony. She asked him why. He said because she had asked him square and not around the edges, and because the offer he'd made to Harlan had been sitting uncollected for 7 years, and he preferred it to be used. She accepted. She wrote it down in the ledger that evening, $250 borrowed from Amos Tilley, to be repaid over 24 months with simple interest at 5%. Then she counted what she had. 92 plus 250 was $342. She needed $388. She was still $46 short, with the November cattle check pending. She had sold enough cattle that the remaining 35 head were her working stock, and she was not willing to sell further, but she had not yet tallied the November grazing fee rebate from the ridge lease that the previous tenant had arranged with Harlan, and that she had not known existed until she found the relevant paper in the drawer behind the ledger. That rebate came in at $53 in the 3rd week of November, mailed from the leaseholder's office in Cheyenne. She put it in the envelope with the rest, counted the whole, and found she had $395, which was 15 more than she needed. Then the ice storm came. It started on the 22nd of November, which was a Wednesday, as a cold rain out of the north that turned to sleet by mid-afternoon and to freezing rain by dark. By Thursday morning, the fence posts wore 2 inches of clear ice, and the water troughs had gone solid, and the temperature had dropped to 17 below zero, which is cold enough to kill cattle that have gone more than 12 hours without feed and water. And the herd was in the north pasture where the hay was not. She found out about the hay situation at first light Thursday when she went to the barn. She had moved the hay supply into the barn in September and stacked it properly, but the barn door on the north side, which had been latched with a wooden bar since October, had been forced by the ice load on the roof above it overnight, and a section of hay nearest that wall had gone wet when the runoff came in along the base. The wet hay wasn't feedable, not in this weather. The dry hay remaining was sufficient for perhaps 2 days at the rate the herd would need to eat to maintain heat. She looked at what was there for a while. Then she hitched Biscuit to the heavy sledge. Amos's barn was 3/4 of a mile to the west along the ridge track. He had her 40% of the cut still in his barn, 31 bales, stacked against the north wall, dry and properly covered. The ridge track was glazed over with ice an inch deep, and the temperature was still dropping. Biscuit was a bay work mule, 14 hands with broad feet and a low center of gravity, and he had been on that track in bad weather before, which is not nothing, because a mule will refuse to cross ice that is not sound, and he knows the difference better than a horse does. He went onto the track without hesitation, which told Clayton what she needed to know about the footing. She hauled 8 bales on the first run, which was what the sledge could carry on that surface without risk of tipping. 8 bales took most of the morning to move, because the 1.5-mile round trip was slow going, and she had to offload at the north pasture gate and carry each bale by hand the last 40 yards to the hay ring, because the gate path was too ice to bring the sledge through. Her hands were wrapped in 2 layers of wool, and then leather gloves over that, and by the second run they were stiff enough that she had to use her palms to grip the knots rather than her fingers. The storm ran for 3 days. It did not let up on Friday, and it did not let up on Saturday, and each morning she rose at 4 o'clock and hitched Biscuit in the dark and drove the track. She moved 31 bales in 9 runs. She broke the water troughs open with a mallet twice daily and let the cattle drink before the surface refroze. And she moved the youngest and thinnest animals into the smaller corral beside the barn, where the windbreak was better. On the second day, a Friday, Dora came out to the barn before dawn, dressed and wearing her heavy coat, and said she was coming. Clayton looked at her in the lamplight. She told Dora to go back inside and keep the stove going and the water hot, because when she came in after the runs, she would need both. And that was not a small job. It was the job that made everything else possible. Dora looked at her for a moment, the way she had looked at the road in the evenings, measuring the direction of things. Then she went back inside without arguing. On the third morning, a Saturday, the temperature had dropped to 31 below zero by the small thermometer nailed to the barn frame, and the sky was the flat white that means the cold has settled in and will not lift until it decides to. And Biscuit's breath came in long, thin jets that hung in the air for seconds after he exhaled. She had 7 bales left in Amos's barn. She made 2 runs. By the second run, she had lost feeling in her feet, and both her hands were clamped around the reins by habit, more than sensation, and the muscles in her back had tightened to the point where turning her torso required a separate decision each time she needed to look behind her. She brought the last bale to the hay ring at 11 in the morning and stood at the north pasture gate and looked at the herd. They were moving, slow and deliberate in the cold, but moving, heads down into the hay, sides steaming slightly. She counted them, 31 head, every one of them on their feet. She walked back to the barn and unhitched Biscuit and rubbed him down with the dry cloth she kept hanging for the purpose, and gave him extra grain from the covered bin, measuring it carefully and then adding another cup, because he had earned it, and she was not the kind of person who forgets that. If there is one thing the frontier teaches a person who is paying attention, it is that the work and the animal that carries you through it deserve the same honest accounting. Inside, the stove was hot, and the water was ready, as Dora had promised. She put her hands flat on the stove surface without quite touching it, and stood there until the blood came back in enough to hurt. And then she sat at the table and drank 2 cups of hot water, and ate bread, and did not say much. After a while, Dora sat down across from her and said that all the cattle were okay. Clayton said she believed so. Yes. Dora looked at her across the table and said, quietly and without any particular dramatics, that she had known her mother would bring them through. Clayton did not say anything to that for a moment. Then she reached across and touched Dora's hand once, briefly, and stood up to refill her cup. The storm broke on Sunday morning. The temperature came up to 12 below, which felt almost warm after what had been. She spent Sunday breaking the troughs again and checking each animal by hand, running her palm along flanks, lifting feet to check for ice balls in the frogs, watching breath and gait for anything that signaled trouble. By Sunday evening, she had found 2 animals that needed attention, one with a mild case of exposure at the ears, and one with a split hoof that had likely gone undetected before the storm. She treated both, and both recovered, and the morning count on Monday was 31, head on their feet and feeding. She went inside on Monday evening, took out the ledger, and ran the numbers one final time. The loan balance was $480. She had $395 in the envelope, and 15 of it was surplus. She did not touch the surplus. She counted out $480 in full, which she had assembled in a combination of paper notes and coin. The paper notes from the Laramie Bank where she had deposited the proceeds, and the coin from the small iron box in the drawer where she had been putting the small amounts as they came in through the fall. She folded it, put it in the envelope, sealed the envelope, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went to bed and slept 7 hours, which was the longest she had slept in a month. The bank had given her until the 5th of December. Crane arrived at first light on the 4th. She was already on the porch when his rig came up the lane. She heard the horse on the frozen track before she saw the rig, and she was not surprised because she had expected him that week and had been on the porch each morning since Monday. The frost was on the fence posts and Biscuit was in the yard, exhaling slow into the cold, the same as always. The same as the morning this story opened, and the sky was just beginning to go gray at the ridgeline. Crane set the brake and came toward the steps with his satchel, and she saw the moment he registered her expression, or rather her lack of one, and she watched him recalibrate his opening sentences in real time, adjusting from the version he had prepared for a woman who was going to make this difficult to a version, for something he had not entirely anticipated. She held out the envelope before he reached the steps. He stopped on the bottom step and took it. He opened it there, standing in the cold, and counted the notes and then the coin. His breath made small clouds in the air between them. It took him a minute. Then he looked up. She said that she was paying the balance in full as of that date and would want a receipt when he had one prepared. He said he could prepare one now, and reached into his satchel and found his receipt book, and he wrote it out there on the step, using the satchel as a surface, and when he had signed it, he handed it up to her. She folded it and put it in her pocket. He looked at her for a moment. He was not an unkind man, as has already been said, and what crossed his face then was not embarrassment exactly, but something close to it. The expression of a man who formed an opinion in August that has not survived December. He said that she had done a considerable piece of work. She said she supposed she had. He picked up his satchel, touched the brim of his hat, walked back to his rig, and drove away. Amos Tilley had ridden over that morning on some pretext about a fence corner they shared. A pretext so thin that when he arrived and found Crane's rig at the yard, he had the decency to look mildly embarrassed about the transparency of it. He had been standing by the corral with Biscuit when the handoff happened, close enough to see the envelope change hands and the receipt book come out of the satchel. He was still there when Crane's rig turned at the end of the lane. He did not say congratulations or anything of that nature. He said that the fence corner could wait if she had other things on her morning. She said the fence corner could wait. He nodded and turned his horse back toward the ridge. And then, almost as an afterthought, still looking at the lane where Crane's rig had gone, he said she had cut the hay cleaner than he'd expected. It was the closest thing to a tribute that the morning would carry, and it was enough. The $15 of surplus she applied to Amos's loan on the first payment, which she made in January of 1884, along with the scheduled monthly amount. She paid him every month for 23 months, never late. And on the final payment, she wrote over herself and handed it to him at his door, instead of mailing it. He put it in his coat pocket and told her the arrangement had worked out well. She agreed that it had. They stood on his porch for a few minutes talking about the spring calving, and then she rode home on Biscuit in the thin February light and put the receipt in the drawer where the ledger had been. What followed those 90 days was 24 years of working that land. She rebuilt the north fence the following spring, replacing 6 posts and 4 full sections of wire, doing the work herself with Dora helping to hold the stays while she drove the staples. She bought 2 replacement cattle to bring the herd back to a working 35, selected with the particular care of a woman who had now examined 38 animals for weakness and knew what she was looking for. She added a small chicken house in 1885 and a second hay shed in 1887, the shed built with timber hauled from the ridge in 2 loads on Amos's wagon. because by 1887 they had settled into the easy habit of neighbors who have moved past the history between their families and found that the present is sufficient. Dora grew up on that farm and knew it the way her mother did, from the inside out, from the way the creek ran in a wet spring versus a dry one, from the sound the cattle made in the north pasture when they were content versus the sound they made when they were cold and hungry. She went to school in town through 1889 and then came back. And by the early 1890s, she was managing the east pasture independently, making the decisions about when to cut and when to graze, and making them well. Amos was at the place most weeks in the later years, not for any formal reason, but because neighboring had become a comfortable habit, and because Clayton made good coffee and did not waste his time with conversation that had no point to it. He would sometimes sit on the porch in the evening and watch the ridge go dark and not say much, and she would sit in the other chair and not say much either, and Biscuit would move slow around the corral below. And that was a perfectly good way to spend an evening, and they both knew it. Biscuit worked the West Farm until 1901, when he was somewhere past 30 years old, which is old for any animal, and especially old for a working mule in Wyoming country. He slowed in his last years, going to pasture rather than harness, but he was in good flesh to the end, and he knew the farm as well as any creature on it, following the fence lines of his own accord and standing at the gate in the mornings as if he might still be needed. When he died in October of that year, Dora and Clayton buried him at the north pasture edge, near the hay ring he had circled so many times in the dark before dawn, and Dora put a flat stone at the head of the place and left it unmarked, because what else do you say? There is a kind of country knowledge that doesn't come from being told things and doesn't come from reading them, but comes from standing in the same place through enough seasons that the land and the person begin to understand each other. Clayton West had that, and she spent 24 years deepening it, and the farm grew steadily under those years, not dramatically, not with any single great expansion, but with the patient accretion of a woman who reinvested what she earned and learned from what did not work and never borrowed what she could not service. By 1905, the herd was at 45 head, and the east and south pastures were both producing cleaner hay than they had under Harlan's management, not because Clayton was a harder worker than her husband had been, but because she had studied where the grass grew best and had fenced accordingly, and because she was not too proud to ask Amos what he thought about drainage, and had then actually done what he suggested. The note on the farm was long since settled, and the title was clear, and there was a small savings account in her name at the same bank in Rawlins where Crane had once worked. Though Crane himself had transferred to a branch in Cheyenne years before, she was 60 years old in the spring of 1909, and her hands by then were the hands of the ledger's bottom line made visible, cracked at every knuckle and scarred along the palms from wire and wood and the particular rough texture of a mule's harness in cold weather. Dora would sometimes look at them and think of a tintype she had seen in a drawer once, her mother in her early 30s, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, expression unreadable and entirely steady, and understand that the hands in the tintype and the hands in front of her were the same hands, just more honestly themselves. Clayton West died in the autumn of 1907, which was 4 years before Biscuit, a fact that would have amused her if she had thought to note it, though she was not in general a woman who spent time on irony. She died in the way she had lived, without excess. A short illness in October, the doctor riding out from town twice, Dora beside her for the last 3 days. She was 58 years old. Dora buried her on the ridge above the farm, in the place that had a long view west toward Amos's spread and south toward the valley floor where the creek made its flat loop before continuing toward the Sweetwater. It was the spot Clayton had pointed to once, years before, saying only that it was a good place to look from, and Dora had remembered. Amos Tilley was there. He was the only neighbor present who had been present at the beginning of the story, and he stood at the edge of the grave with his hat in his hands and did not say much afterward, which was correct because some things are not made better by being said. If you have known someone who held a hard place through sheer patient competence and refused to let a small world's low opinion set the terms, leave a comment below and tell that story. It's worth telling. And if this kind of story is the kind that keeps you company in the evenings, there are others here that run the same length and carry the same weight. The farm ran another 20 years under Dora's hand, and her children after her. They kept the flat stone at the north pasture edge all those years, uncarved and unmoved. And in spring the grass around it always came up greener than the surrounding ground, the way grass does over a place where something good was returned to the earth. And up on the ridge above the valley, if you went there on a clear morning when the frost was still on the fence posts and the light was coming in flat across the Sweetwater plain, you would find a simple marker in the ground and a view that went on for 30 miles, west and south, over every acre that had been held and worked and earned, one season at a time, against every reasonable expectation.